Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
On my birthday, when the restaurant lights reflected off the polished glasses and the quiet murmur of relatives filled the air, my father stood, raised his glass, and turned what should have been a moment of celebration into something closer to a public execution. With his familiar grin that always carried more condescension than warmth, he said, to my daughter Emily, who may not be as successful as her sister, but hey, at least she tries. I felt the words hit harder than any toast should, the laughter of a few cousins ringing sharp in my ears, and in that instant the cake, the decorations, and the carefully chosen dress I had put on that morning became meaningless. He wasn't congratulating me. He was using me as the punchline for his endless obsession with reminding everyone who the real star of the family was. For years I had endured these small humiliations, little digs, backhanded compliments, remarks that seemed almost designed to shrink me in front of others. My sister, Amanda, was always the golden child, the one Dad paraded as though her every step carried divine favor, while I was treated as the well-meaning understudy who would never headline her own show. And yet, on that night, in that dimly lit room with waiters hovering discreetly and my family smiling like an audience at a bad sitcom, something happened that shifted the balance entirely. Sitting only 2 seats away from me was my boss, Richard, a man I had worked with for nearly a decade, respected for his sharpness and unnerving ability to catch lies with the ease of someone swatting flies. My mother had invited him, hoping it would impress Dad to see that someone of status respected my work enough to share a meal with us. When my father delivered his cruel toast, Richard barely flinched. He sipped his wine, leaned back, and in a tone as casual as if he were ordering dessert, said, "That's odd. Your daughter Amanda has been trying to get a job with me for months now." The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced in that family. It wasn't the awkward pause of bad timing or the hush before polite laughter. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness where every person at that table, from my youngest cousin to my grandmother, turned to Amanda as though they were watching a magician caught mid-trick. Amanda, who had perfected the role of untouchable success, froze. Her face, always composed, tightened, and in that moment I saw her carefully painted confidence collapse. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came. I didn't gloat outwardly, though the urge pressed hard against my chest. Instead, I stared at my plate, cutting into the roasted chicken with deliberate slowness, pretending not to notice the way Dad's grin had vanished or how Amanda's cheeks had gone pale. Inside, though, a storm of conflicting feelings raged. Vindication, yes, but also an unease I couldn't quite name. Because if Richard knew about Amanda's attempts, then what else did he know? And what did it mean for me, sitting between a father who belittled me and a boss who had just casually detonated a truth bomb that could shatter the golden image of my sister? Amanda finally managed a laugh, brittle and sharp, the kind people use when they're cornered and desperate to claw back control. "Oh, Richard, you must be mistaken," she said, her voice rising an octave higher than usual. "I was only considering, exploring options, but nothing serious." Her eyes darted around the table, searching for allies, but found only the lowered gazes of relatives who had long resented her bragging. Richard did not press further, but the damage was done. The words hung in the air, undeniable and heavy, while my father shifted uncomfortably, caught between defending his favorite child and acknowledging the crack in her perfect facade. He muttered something about opportunities being plentiful, but even he couldn't quite muster the same bravado. For the first time in years, Amanda looked small, and I, without lifting a finger, felt a flicker of power in a room where I had always been the one diminished. As the plates clattered and the waiter nervously offered dessert menus, the tension never eased. My mother tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground, but each attempt died quickly, suffocated by the memory of Richard's words. I watched Amanda sip her wine with shaking hands, her knuckles pale, and I knew that this night was not just a birthday, it was the beginning of something neither of us could take back. I didn't speak much more through the rest of dinner. I didn't need to. Every smile Amanda forced looked like it might split her skin. Every glance from Dad seemed to beg for this moment to be erased. But it couldn't be. The truth had been set loose, and no amount of polished stories could cage it again. By the time the cake came, candles flickering weakly in the dim light, I made my wish silently. I didn't wish for love, or money, or even peace. I wished for the strength to finally stop being the shadow and to let Amanda, for once, feel the burn of standing in someone else's. I blew out the candles slowly, savoring the smoke as it curled upward like a secret signal only I understood. And as the night ended, I saw Amanda slip outside, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her voice trembling as she tried to explain something to someone on the other end. My father avoided my eyes completely. Richard gave me a nod, subtle and unreadable, before leaving with the kind of calmness that only comes from knowing exactly the effect you've had. When I climbed into my car that night, the taste of frosting still on my tongue, I knew the story of my family had just shifted in a way none of us could control. But what I didn't yet know was how far Amanda would go to repair her image, or how ready I was to watch her unravel. The room did not bounce back the way family gatherings usually do after someone tells a clumsy joke or drops a glass, because the silence that Richard's offhand comment had stitched into the air behaved less like a pause and more like a heavy blanket that refused to be lifted, and as the waiter came with the dessert menus and the complimentary birthday flutes of Prosecco, I watched my mother attempt to summon her gentle hostess voice while her eyes telegraphed a quiet panic that said she already regretted inviting my boss in the first place, while my father stared into his drink as though he might find a rescue line curling at the bottom like a peel of lemon he could fish out and wave as proof that nothing serious had actually happened. Amanda tried to reset the script with that bright, brittle tone she reserves for bridal showers and social media lives, saying how the market is dynamic and how networking is just curiosity with better shoes. Yet the speech sounded like it had been written for a version of herself who had not just been outed by the one person in the room whose inbox could confirm the truth in a single search. And the cousins who normally orbit her like holiday lights began to look anywhere else, tracing the grain in the table or stirring ice in their water glasses like amateur bartenders lost in thought, which, I will admit, gave me a small and uncharitable thrill even as I kept my face as calm as a pond that has swallowed a stone and refuses to burp. Because I am not made of stone, and because the thing about humiliation is that it ferments into a sharp wit if you let it sit long enough, I lifted my glass and, with as much lightness as I could craft without sounding fake, suggested we play a birthday game that my team at work does during quarterly offsites, a round of best lesson from a flop, where each person shares one thing that didn't go as planned and the small miracle they wrestled from it. And I dressed it in enough self-deprecation that even the prickliest uncle felt safe, telling them how I once sent a client deck with a slide labeled final_really_final, and learned that confidence can live happily next to honesty if you buy them both coffee and let them talk it out. It worked the way honey works on a burn, drawing people out slowly and sweetly, with Aunt Valerie admitting she tried to make sourdough without feeding the starter and ended up baptizing the trash can. And my cousin Mark confessing he once wore 2 different shoes to an HOA meeting and negotiated the landscaping budget anyway, which loosened the room just enough for laughter to come back in little waves that felt human again rather than scripted. And when it was Amanda's turn, she tried to pass, then realized the pass would be louder than any confession, so she said, with a tight smile that looked like it had been stapled on, that she had overreached in a networking email, which was a poetic way to describe forwarding her resume twice in 1 week to the same executive with 3 different subject lines, and I, still smiling, said the gentle kind of sentence that takes off like a paper airplane and lands with surprising accuracy. That bold outreach is admirable, especially when it includes accurate dates for employment and the correct names of awards, and I let the words hover there, not a direct accusation, not an indictment, just a small lantern held up in a dim hallway to make the crooked picture frame obvious. Dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, because detail has always been his weak spot, and the moment you mention dates, he remembers calendars, and the year he pushed Amanda through a summer program by calling in favors while I was working at a craft store counting beads and pretending that glitter made me happy. And he shot me a look that asked me to stand down from whatever I was doing, But I had done almost nothing except describe truth, as if it were a piece of furniture everyone already knew was in the room, which is the exquisite thing about a certain kind of revenge, that it arrives disguised as reasonable commentary and only later do you understand it had teeth. Richard, who had been quiet and politely focused on the creme brulee, like a man judging the shatter of the sugar lid for sport, cleared his throat and told a story about sending a pitch deck to the wrong investor years ago and how the mortification lasted exactly one afternoon because, as he put it, the market forgives what you fix quickly and punishes what you pretend never happened. And he glanced at me for the length of a heartbeat that felt like a handshake under the table, which my mother noticed, because mothers always do, and she pivoted into a toast for resilience that tried very hard to include everyone equally, though the pronouns stumbled over themselves when they came near Amanda's chair. The waiter brought out a sheet cake the size of a coffee table. My mother had gone full suburban birthday, bless her heart, with a frosting script that read, "To many more wins." And, because I could not resist the temptation that the universe had plated and set in front of me with a garnish of candied orange, I asked the staff, as lightly as a breeze, whether the restaurant still did the little tradition of writing a single word on a chocolate plaque for the person of honor to snap into for luck, and when the manager nodded I said, "Let's write truth, because honestly, that is the only gift I want to keep opening this year," which made the younger cousins laugh and the older relatives murmur, and when the plaque arrived I held it up, said, "To truth shared kindly and completely," and broke it cleanly, handing one half to Amanda without a speech, without a glare, without anything except a steady smile that said I was finished being the soft landing for other people's myths. Amanda set the chocolate down as though it might stain her dress, pushed her chair back with a scrape that made nearby tables flinch, and stood very straight, the way a person stands when they intend to argue in heels, then announced that she needed fresh air. That the room was stuffy, that this whole thing had spiraled because of a misunderstanding, and my mother followed her with an apologetic glance at me while Dad remained seated as if his spine were bolted to the chair, and for a second, the entire restaurant felt like a stage where someone had cut the lights except for two stubborn spotlights, one on my father's jaw, clenched around the old script, and one on my empty plate where the chocolate word had left a small echo of sweetness. He leaned toward me with the careful hush of a man negotiating in a church pew and said I had made my point and that family should protect family even from inconvenient truths. And I told him in a voice only he could hear that protection without accountability is just favoritism with perfume, and that I was done being scented to make other people comfortable. And I watched that sentence land in him the way a metal key drops into a drawer, solid and unmistakable, and then my phone buzzed on the table, face up. A text from an unfamiliar number with a preview line that made my mouth go dry. "Hi, Emily. This is Human Resources from Richard's firm, about Amanda's references and a conversation we need to have tomorrow morning." By morning, the text from Human Resources had metabolized into that peculiar mixture of dread and opportunity that arrives when a storm cloud hangs directly over a garden you have tended quietly for years. And while the coffee maker groaned its way toward competence, I stared at the message again, noting the polite phrasing that masked a clear request for clarity about employment dates, titles, and a curious reference to an award Amanda had claimed in her application which, as far as our records suggested, had never been issued by our firm or affiliated with any of our projects, and I felt the muscle memory of being the household's designated fixer twitch in my hands before I reminded myself that the role had been retired ceremoniously and forever last night over a slab of cake and a chocolate plaque named Truth. Amanda called before the first cup finished filling, her voice carrying that manic brightness that pretends to be calm while dragging panic by the wrist, insisting that the text to me must be some clerical hiccup, that Human Resources had probably typed the wrong number, that I should simply smooth it out with Richard because, after all, she and I were family and family should operate like a closed loop where problems get digested privately and excreted as polite smiles. And while she chattered about timing and impressions and how cruel it would be to let a technicality ruin a mutually beneficial fit. I watched the drip tray catch a dark spill and thought about all the years I had been the tray, catching and wiping so no one else had to notice. And I told her, with a steadiness that surprised even me, that Human Resources had contacted me because my name appeared as a reference on her materials, which was an imaginative decision on her part since she had not asked me, and that I would be honest if asked, because I had learned the hard way that pretending helps no one in the long run, least of all the pretender. She tried to pivot into guilt, invoking our father's health and our mother's nerves, and the supposed optics of a sister undermining a sister, and I let her words pass over me like a weather report about a state I no longer lived in. Then I said we could speak after I met with Richard and the team because, unlike the tales spun around holiday tables, our office required substantiation, documented timelines, and the kind of receipts that do not wilt when held up to light. And before she could reload her argument, I ended the call, turned my phone face down, and allowed myself one deep breath that tasted like resolve. At the office, the air carried that productive hum I have always loved, the blend of keyboards, low voices, and the faint hiss of the espresso machine that means people are building something together. And Richard waved me into a glass conference room with a nod that was almost gentle, the kind of gesture that says we will not turn this into spectacle, which I appreciated more than I could say. And he slid a thin folder toward me containing a printout of Amanda's resume, a short list of claims, highlighted in yellow, and a cover email whose tone had been crafted by someone who had learned diplomacy from the school of relentless facts, and he asked, without drama, whether I was comfortable answering a few verification questions because my name, inexplicably, appeared as a professional reference who could speak to her leadership on a client project that began the year I was still a junior analyst quietly building slide libraries. I told him I was comfortable, and then I gave him the clean version of the truth, not weaponized, not theatrical, just a timeline that aligned with calendars and documented roles, and I added, because it mattered, that if Amanda had skills to bring to any team, they would reveal themselves best under honest light, which is not an act of sabotage, but an act of respect to the work itself, and Richard listened with that forensic calm he wears when the room needs one adult. Then thanked me, closed the folder, and said Human Resources would handle the rest. Outside the conference room, I did the small administrative things that mark a turning point more clearly than a speech. Forwarding Human Resources a concise note confirming the factual corrections while explicitly recusing myself from further reference involvement due to familial conflict, copying Richard for transparency, and adding a single sentence that read, in the politest language I could assemble, that all future verification should be conducted strictly via listed former supervisors and documented deliverables, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of changing the locks without touching a single hinge, and as my message whooshed out I felt something unclench that had taken years to form. At lunch my phone vibrated again, this time not with Amanda's number, but with a chain of messages from our family group chat where Dad was building a familiar narrative about betrayal and loyalty and how a household should present one story to the world. To which I responded with a brief line about the difference between unity and complicity and the fact that I would not be commenting further. Then I set the thread to mute and returned to my desk, where a colleague, oblivious to the drama, asked whether I would review a draft for the client pitch, and I said yes with relief, because real work has always been my preferred antidote to manufactured chaos. Near mid-afternoon, reception pinged me with a note that an applicant had arrived early for an informational, and the name written in the politely neutral font made my ribcage tighten, because Amanda was in the lobby. A full hour before the meeting Human Resources had scheduled to clarify her materials, and for a moment I considered slipping down the back stairs and leaving the building entirely. Then I remembered the promise I had made to myself above a plate of frosting, and I walked to the elevator with my shoulders level and my face calm, ready to be courteous and firm and very, very clear, and as the doors opened onto the marble foyer I saw her reflection first, adjusting her jacket. practicing a smile that would have won awards in any other decade, and behind the reception desk the security screen flashed a new message from compliance asking whether they should proceed with the standard portfolio skills test we give to questionable resumes, which was the moment I realized that justice sometimes hums quietly through procedure, and I nodded to the guard with a calmness that felt almost luxurious and said, in a voice that carried just enough, that the standard process would be perfect. Compliance ushered Amanda into the small conference room we reserve for skills screenings, a glass box that manages to feel exposed and airless at the same time. And while the coordinator explained the guidelines with the crisp cadence of someone who has done this 100 times, no outside materials, anonymized task, 40 minutes to outline an approach and 20 to defend it, I stood just beyond the door with a stack of printouts I had selected from the standard library, not to sabotage her with trickery, because I refused to become the villain in the story my father prefers to tell, but to ensure that whatever happened in that room would be measurable, fair, and honest. Which is a form of revenge I have learned to love precisely because it does not require raised voices or dramatic flourishes, only light and time. The coordinator chose the task envelope at random, yet randomness has a sense of humor, and as she slid the brief across the table, I recognized the scenario immediately. A modest but thorny grant proposal analysis for a network of community gardens that needed a clean budget model, a rationale for phased implementation, and a one-page executive summary that could survive a boardroom with short attention spans and strong opinions, which incidentally echoed the same category of work Amanda had cited as her award-winning leadership on her resume, and because the universe sometimes sets the table with symmetry, the rubric included a section on citing previous comparable projects with verifiable links, meaning that vague name-dropping would tangle itself in seconds. I watched through the glass as she skimmed the brief, smoothed the paper with meticulous care, and began to write quickly, producing the kind of confident handwriting that has always photographed well on social media. And for a moment I felt the old ache of wanting her to succeed simply because it would make the family quieter and the holidays less exhausting. Then I remembered the late nights I had spent untangling budgets and the mornings I had endured being told I was the steady one while someone else accepted applause on a stage I had helped build, and the ache hardened into resolve, because honesty is not cruelty, it is alignment. When the defense portion began, 2 colleagues joined via video to play the skeptical board members, and I sat in the back as the silent observer required by policy, taking notes that would become part of the file. And Amanda launched into her plan with speed and shine, advocating for a splashy pilot in a high-visibility neighborhood that would create energy, a phrase that sounds wise until you realize energy does not plant tomatoes or reconcile payroll. And when one colleague asked how she would handle vendor constraints during the second phase, she pivoted to partnership synergies, which is a charming thought, but still not a mulch delivery schedule. And I watched the panel's faces tilt from polite interest to that unmistakable expression professionals wear when they realize they are hearing a confident answer to a different question. The moment arrived when the rubric required a comparison to past work, and Amanda referenced a project whose name I knew down to the font on the cover slide, because it had been mine. A 2-quarter effort stitched together during the kind of summer that convinces you adulthood is a bunker you choose every morning, and she described it with half-remembered details, praising its innovative stakeholder cadence, while getting the timeline wrong by an entire season, at which point one of the video colleagues asked, in the friendly tone that never signals mercy, who had signed off on the risk register and whether she could recall the compliance tags used for third-party volunteers, and Amanda smiled. The way people smile when they are searching a dark drawer for keys they have not owned, and said the sign-off came from a director who had left the firm before the project started, and that the tags were standard, which is like calling a lock metal. Technically true somewhere in the universe, and useless in this one. Because the observer may ask exactly one clarifying question for the record when the panel stalls, I used my single arrow with care, framing it as an invitation rather than a trap, asking whether the comparative project had included a phased refrigeration requirement for seed storage, a tiny but memorable headache we solved with a local credit union and a vendor who only invoiced on even weeks. And the pause that followed did not need translation, because anyone who has actually touched a problem remembers the texture of the bandage they used, and Amanda's mouth opened and closed once before she said she would have to circle back, which, in a defense session with an anonymized rubric, reads exactly the way it sounds. After the coordinator thanked her and escorted her to the lobby with the soothing promise of an email soon, the panel submitted their scores, which were not cruel, but were unmistakably honest. Noting presentation sparkle and strategic enthusiasm balanced against a consistent absence of technical grounding and a worrisome reliance on glossy generalities. And I added my brief observer note about the misattributed sign-off and the incorrect compliance tags, then signed the form that marked the screen complete, which delivered the small and satisfying thrum of a revenge earned not by sharp elbows, but by a level floor. I returned to my desk to find a voicemail from my father, a long and theatrical sermon about family image and how reputations must be protected the way one protects a lawn from dandelions, which, ironically, are edible and cheerful. And I let his words run out without reply because nothing seduces dysfunction like an audience, then opened my inbox to a message flagged high priority from Richard containing exactly 2 sentences and a calendar hold for early next week. The first line confirming that Human Resources had concluded their review and would proceed with the standard outcome, and the second asking me, pleasantly, professionally, unmistakably, whether I was ready to discuss stepping into a role whose description matched a promotion we had only ever circled in cautious conversations. And before I could exhale, another notification bloomed on my screen from security with a subject line that made my palms go cold, stating that during today's screening a visitor had attempted to upload external files through a blocked route and that a removable drive had been quarantined for review, which meant the story had not decided to end in the conference room after all. When the compliance officer slid the small silver drive across my desk in a sealed plastic pouch, the kind usually reserved for confiscated items that could alter an investigation, I felt the entire arc of my family's mythology collapse into a single moment of cheap desperation, because the log confirmed what the system had already flagged. Amanda had attempted to introduce pre-written material during the evaluation. Fragments of a glossy proposal downloaded from a public consultancy database. A move so careless it would have been caught by even the kindest of filters. And I realized with an ache that sat deeper than anger that she had not come to prove herself at all, but to preserve the fiction that had kept her standing on pedestals built by other people's hands. The officer, speaking in the professional monotone of someone who has no appetite for melodrama, informed me the material would be archived, the report submitted, and the matter formally closed, yet his words landed like the tolling of a bell whose sound carries further than the village intends, and I understood that the reverberation would not stop at the office door, but would travel back into the living room of my childhood, where my father still clung to the fantasy that Amanda's brilliance excused everything and that my steadiness was nothing more than background lighting. That weekend we gathered again, not in a restaurant with careful waiters, but in my parents' living room, where the scent of roast beef mingled with the faint mildew of old carpet and the endless chatter of relatives who had heard just enough rumors to arrive with appetites sharpened for spectacle. And when Amanda walked in late, her lipstick a shade too bright for the daylight and her eyes carefully armored, the air folded in on itself the way it always does before lightning decides where to strike. My father, determined to seize control of the narrative, lifted his glass once again, repeating the gesture that had started this entire unraveling, and in a voice pitched to sound commanding he declared that families are strongest when they close ranks, that outside observers misunderstand what true success looks like, and that his daughters, though different, are each remarkable in their own right. But the words trembled at the edges because he knew as well as I did that half the room had already heard whispers about the evaluation and the drive, and his toast sounded less like a proclamation and more like a man patching leaks with paper towels. I let him finish, then waited just long enough for the silence to hang awkwardly before I set my fork down and, in a voice calm enough to cut glass, announced that I had accepted a promotion, effective immediately. One that recognized years of work completed quietly and without ceremony, and I described the projects I would now lead with a specificity that made it clear I had not invented them overnight. Because the greatest satisfaction lies not in showy declarations, but in the undeniable weight of detail, and I watched as recognition flickered across the faces around the table, each relative recalibrating their understanding of me with the speed of people adjusting binoculars. Amanda smiled too quickly, clapped her hands with brittle enthusiasm, and then, as though unable to stop herself, made the mistake of claiming she had recently been offered something similar, which opened the door I had been holding shut until precisely that moment. I told the table that I hoped all of us would pursue opportunities honestly, because organizations today were careful, thorough, and unwilling to overlook discrepancies, and that attempts to shortcut the process usually left records that were difficult to erase, and I held her eyes while I said it, not accusing directly but letting the implication build in the room like smoke that seeps under every door until everyone smells it. And Amanda's smile faltered just enough for the cousins to notice. My father shifted in his chair, his face flushing with the effort of maintaining composure, and my mother, caught between loyalty and truth, pressed her napkin to her mouth as though she could hide behind the fabric, and in that instant I felt the revenge crystallize. Not as a shout, not as an exposure with evidence waved in the air, but as the simple fact that everyone present now understood which of his daughters had built her life on steady foundations, and which had balanced on scaffolds made of borrowed planks. Dinner limped on, conversation scattering like nervous birds, and when the plates were cleared, Amanda disappeared to the hallway under the pretense of a call that never seemed to connect, while Dad muttered something about the unfairness of modern standards, though he avoided meeting my gaze. Richard's message pinged my phone in the middle of dessert, a congratulatory note copied to several senior partners that would circulate further than either of us intended. And as I slipped the phone back into my purse, I understood that the story could no longer be controlled by family narratives, because now it belonged to a wider audience who would measure me by the solidity of my work rather than the shadow I had been told to inhabit. When I left that evening, stepping out into the cool night where the streetlights glowed with the indifferent steadiness of witnesses who have seen every kind of drama unfold beneath them, I paused at my car and considered what it meant that Amanda had chosen a removable drive rather than facing a blank page, and what it meant that my father, even confronted with cracks wide enough to swallow a reputation hole, still clung to the version of events that allowed him to sleep without rewriting his past judgments. I realized, with a kind of weary clarity, that revenge had not been the final goal, but merely the tool that carved space for something else, a life no longer tethered to defending my worth at a table that had never intended to recognize it. And yet, even as I drove away, the ambiguity lingered, because Amanda's story was not finished, and families have long memories that twist truths into new shapes, and I knew that the next gathering would come with fresh scripts and unexpected lines. But for the first time I felt no need to rehearse my defense, no need to brace for humiliation disguised as humor, because I had learned that the most devastating form of revenge is not the exposure of another's weakness, but the quiet decision to stop asking for their approval. And as the road stretched ahead, I let the silence fill with possibilities that had been waiting for years, patient and steady, just beyond the noise.